Rebecca.
And I'm Charlene. Welcome to Empowered, Life Lessons of Everyday Women.
Each episode, you're going to meet an amazing woman who has struggled through challenges both in her home life and work life and has become very successful. We are so excited to be starting season 2. This has been an amazing experience for me. I've had so much fun along the way.
We've had so much insight from these women. They are amazing. And one of the things that our takeaway has been every time we do a recording after we're done, Rebecca and I look at each other and say, oh my gosh, that was amazing. And we love sharing this with our listeners.
Absolutely. I think one of my biggest takeaways was the importance of mentoring and networking. I think a lot of people don't take the time to put into the mentoring, and networking because they don't have the time, right? They're busy, but that is time well spent. And most of the women we've talked to, that's been their jumping off point to be able to get other places in their career.
One of the things I loved about the networking comment is, and I want to share this with our listeners for sure, is that it starts the beginning of your life. Your networking follows you all along. It's not just when you get your first job. What you do in your life matters along the way.
Absolutely.
Now, my biggest takeaway was, and the reoccurring theme that I think we talked about many, many times was finding passion and joy.
And I think once people found their passion and joy, that's when their job became a career. They didn't mind getting up in the morning to go into work because they loved what they did.
So this has been a joy for us to share with our listeners, and we hope that you find season 2 just as enjoyable.
Thanks for being with us. All right, let's get into our next episode. Meet Beth M. Go to school, get an education. Beth was not able to go to college and get a degree, but her grit and determination drove her to learn computer coding. She eventually bought the company and was able to navigate the pitfalls and grew the business. So, grab a cup of coffee, get in a comfy chair as we talk to Beth. Welcome, Beth. We're so happy you could join us today.
Thank you.
So, if you were able to go back and talk to your 20-year-old self and give her a little piece of advice, what might that be?
Go to school, get your higher education, get in school, and learn all you can learn.
Sounds like experience talking. You want to delve into why that was so important or is so important to you?
Well, I feel like I didn't go to school. I didn't have the opportunity. I laughingly tell people I had a shotgun wedding and I was not pregnant. And I got married. I was married at 18. And off I went into the world. And in those days, my parents, who had put my siblings through school, told me that was my husband's responsibility. And my husband needed to go to school. So I worked and he went to school. So I never got to have an education. And that's a tough way to be successful.
So had you not been married, would your parents have put you through school?
Absolutely.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Did they not like your husband?
Not particularly, but I think it was more of a point. I mean, again, I told you I had a shotgun wedding. So it was a time and there was a lot of crazy things that were happening back then. And I got married in the 79 and graduated from high school on the middle or second week of June. And I was married the first week of August.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Okay. So you spent a lot of time working in the computer systems, and especially without an education. That's pretty impressive. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved with computers and what that was like?
Yes. It was, again, another interesting road. I think there's a country song about God bless this broken road. But I went to college. As I said, we moved to Ellensburg and my husband went to school and I had an opportunity to take one class. I could afford one class. So I took an accounting class and then I could afford one more class. So I took a basic computer programming back then, we were just past the punch cards. I mean, I think it was.
I remember the punch card.
Yes.
Well, for our listeners, they may not know about the punch card.
Yeah, the punch card. So it was a basic computer. My very first program that I learned how to do was a random number generator. So you could guess high, low, and it would tell you whether you were high or low until you could guess the right number. And so that's what I learned how to do. That was the first thing. And so I had one very tiny basic computer software class or intro to computers. And my dad's company, I would have been the fifth generation. My dad was fourth. Had a very large family business, and they made boxes, believe it or not. And they were migrating to an IBM mini mainframe back then, the big old boxes. And I had my accounting background because I had worked in the family, helping during the summer and that kind of stuff. Dad said, I need help, and I want you to come back for the summer and help me get this software loaded into this Mapix system with this accounting. So that's how I got started. I went back to my dad's company and helped him set up the system. And it didn't take me long to realize that we had contractors, and I would ask for an apple and I would get an orange, because that we were just talking in two different languages. So I started teaching myself reading RPG. It was the language. I learned how to get into that because the programmers would have me fix things. And
Talk about empowering yourself, right? I mean, you were going into an industry that's completely new at that point in time, right? And really empowering yourself to learn what you can.
So Beth, I have a similar story. I'll make it really short, but I was working in New York City in advertising at the time, and I inherited in the department there were two little Macs sitting there. They're the Mac SCs, which will tell you how old those are. And my friend who was in graphic design, who was in Connecticut, told me, this is how you turn the power on. So I turned the power on, and this thing was a mess, but I was the first person in the department to get on Apple Macintosh at that time. We had to do hand create everything for, presentations. And all of a sudden I was setting type on an Apple computer, and it turns out I was like this Mac genius. Very similar. And I've been on Macs, and I had a head for it, and I'm totally 100% self-taught.
Yeah, that was me. And I the IBM at the time had a learning lab, if you want to call it that. It was down in downtown Seattle. And I talked my dad into letting me go down and take a couple classes. So it was in the learning lab, self-taught, go through and click on the buttons type of a thing. Very, very basic. That's way before the internet. And due to just some circumstances, my dad and I didn't see eye to eye on everything. And I wanted to have my growth potential in a company that was male dominated and all uncles. And it was a family business, yes. And I was the fifth generation, but I was the first generation woman that did not like being told didn't have an opportunity to be a leader.
Wow.
So that kind of leads me to my question, which is that you transitioned from your family business to another company. Can you talk? Obviously, some of that was being in this sort of hierarchy, as it was, of male-dominated family members. But can you talk a little bit about what made the decision for you to move to another company?
So by that point, I had 3 kids by the time I did make the switch. So I worked for my dad for about 10 years.
Okay.
And I had 3 children, and I was not doing well in my marriage, and I needed income to support my kids. And I decided that I needed more, and I wasn't going to get it where I was. So I went to a recruiter, and a recruiter said to me, I said to him, what is a job that a woman, how can I make the most money? It's money, right? I needed it. I needed a career, and I had no education, formal education. And he looked at me and he said, you don't want that job. And he was implying being a hooker. And I'm like, yeah, no, I don't want that job.
He was right.
He was right. The way a woman in those days, the most money I could make was that way. And I was like, no, that's not going to work for me. So he said, well, do you know anything about computers? And I said, a little bit. I've been to 2 design classes. He goes, well, guess what? You are now an expert because it's a wild, wild west right now. Nobody knows anything. So he got me a job in it was Food Services America. And I went in expecting to be a designer, which I was pretty comfortable with. I had spent now almost 10 years working on systems, designing them, telling the programmers what I wanted, getting feedback. So that was a role I was getting pretty comfortable at. When I got there, they put me in and all of a sudden decided I was going to be a coder. But yes. And I was looking at what they were ever going to pay me. And I was like, okay, so how hard can this be, right? I've been designing it I could read it. By that point, I could read RPG because I had gotten very good at reading it. And I have a very logical mind. So off to the races I went. I was copying the IBM manuals every night. When everybody would go home, I'd copy the manuals and I was going home and trying to read the books and teaching myself how to be a programmer.
Wow.
So again, I'm going to just share this with you too. So I had a retail business at one point and Constant Contact. I don't know if anybody remembers.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
It's the news, it was being used for newsletters and whatever. I was using for my business, emailing. So I would just go into the code. I knew nothing about code, and I was copying and pasting code and making design changes just because I figured it out, which is kind of sounds like what you were doing. I didn't have anybody to lead me, but I thought, oh, this must mean that it's going to be bold, and then I would copy and paste it, and voila, it was bold. So it's kind of interesting that I was doing that on the Mac, and you were doing it in the PC world, so...
Oh, yeah, it was actually, we called it the mainframe, mini mainframe. I was on the IBM System 34 back then.
And those mainframes were huge. They were
huge.
I mean, people don't realize they would take up entire rooms and floors of buildings. Yeah, I remember that.
Your life obviously changed a little bit. You became the sole breadwinner of your family. You had children. Were you able to juggle all the demands on your time and energy?
Not a lot of sleep. I would. and by that time, by the time I had the 3rd child, I had found that in-home care was really the way to go. So I had a nanny that would come in the morning and would stay until I could get home. And when I worked that job at Food Services, I had about an hour and 25 minutes each way was my commute.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was a long commute.
A lot of time to listen to podcasts.
So back to Food Services quickly. First of all, my head boss there my lead came over to me one day and said, just so you know, I don't believe that women have the brains to be software engineers.
Oh my gosh. So you wanted to prove him wrong.
Well, ironically though, there was another guy that had put me in the position that saw, I guess, my leadership potential. And my dad always said, you're a born leader. You can lead, you listen, you make sense, you put pieces together, and you're a good leader. And so I think that's what his boss saw in me, is why he put me in the position he did to begin with. But the gentleman, I was at the vending machine one day. So this went on for a couple of weeks where I was pretending to code, right? Pretending to be busy. And the gentleman behind me was kind of a quirky guy, came up to me at the vending machine one day. Maybe it was a week and a half into it, but he came up and he said, Beth, just so you know, I know you don't know what the heck you're doing. And I said, please don't tell him. I said, every day that I get to work, I'm feeding my kids and I need this money and I'm trying and and he said, but here's the deal. There's this new structured programming language. It was called structured RPG. And I keep telling them, if we will switch to that, we will get this project done on time, ahead of time. We're all going to get our bonuses and we're all going to go down a happy camper. But they won't listen to me. But they want to listen to you and you don't know what you're doing. And I said, okay. He said, it's so easy to learn. I said, well, if it's that easy to learn, can you teach me? And he said, yes, I will teach you.
So he really mentored you. It was a win-win.
He did. And so it was, I believe angels drop into your lives at different times for different reasons. And this was one of mine that put me on a different path. And I said, well, what's that going to cost me? I don't have any money, right? And he said, how about lunch? So for the next couple weeks, I fixed lunch every day, and we sat at a table out of we went to a restaurant away from there so nobody would know what was happening. And he taught me structured RPG code.
Wow. So I was going to wait and ask you this a little bit later on, but what you're talking about sounds like imposter syndrome. Is that what you know what that is? Where you don't feel like you can do something that somebody thinks that you can do.
No, I think it's probably the opposite. I think there's a lot of things I think I can do, and that's what gets me into trouble.
But in a way, you were faking it until you made it.
Right.
Okay.
So I think that I'm thinking more of imposter syndrome as being that, like, you're acting and you feel like you're on the stage, doing your job, but really in reality, you're like quaking a little bit in your boots because
you're figuring it out.
Yeah. So
it's kind of like the duck that looks so graceful on top of the water, and underneath their feet are going like this.
That's a very good visual for sure.
That was me. So at the end, the programs that he taught me became the template. Everybody was using them as the template. We got the project done. We got it done early. We all got our bonuses, and I was a programmer. I came out of there.
Are you still in touch with this person, or
No, I wasn't. I actually, when I ended up buying the company that I ended up owning, I actually found him and offered him a job. Hired him for a while. So I kind of did that payback. He thought things might be a little more romantically involved, and I was not interested in that.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
Went separate ways.
I understand that. So one of the things that you did as you were rising up the ladder in the company that you eventually bought was you got involved with the FDA and the requirements, regulations. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what's entailed? And I'm not talking about in terms of the specific details, but working with a federal entity, mm-hmm. agency has a lot of nuances, I guess, that might be interesting for people to understand how you go about navigating some of those nuances.
Well, again, I'm going to say we were back in that wild, wild west. When I left the one company, again, now I felt empowered. And by the way, I was still with the first husband, and that's where we split. I now had my wings under me. I felt like I could get a good job, and I did. I applied to every job I could find, and I went to work for this company. They had one client that was in the blood bank software business. So I went in as a consultant. So I consulted on several different projects, but one piece was this blood bank software. And that, if you think about the late 80s, early 90s, so this would have been 87, 88, somewhere right in there, we were facing AIDS.
Right.
So the blood industry was struggling, to say the least. And they didn't know what they were dealing with, that early 90, 93, 94, all of that coming up. So by 94-ish is when the FDA, it was just this collision of who was responsible for all this death. And you've got the blood industry and the software and what it was doing and not doing and who was making the decisions. So the FDA got involved because the blood industry came to them and said, please get in here and help us with these software vendors. So the FDA did not, we were the first software only industry that the FDA regulated. The first. Wow. They had no regulations for us. And the way the FDA typically works is that they find one system and they try to parrot it to another. They try to just, shoehorn a round hole into a square peg. So they decided that they were going to call us a device. So we ended up falling under the device regulations. But they knowingly came out and said, we do not really know what this is going to mean. So we're going to have to figure it out together. And it was footsteps in the snow. We put steps in, we backed up, we put steps in, we backed up.
Wow, that sounds incredibly challenging.
It was. And that's in fact how I ended up owning the company, because I believe the regulations were right. When I got there, they were making live changes into the software without one drop of validation.
Oh, my word.
Nothing.
I come from a Six Sigma background, so I know how important it is to make sure that you're understanding the impact of any one change.
Yes.
That is huge.
Nothing. There was nothing. And the phones were ringing like crazy and nobody wanted to answer them because someone was
They
upset.
were trying to plug the dike. Right. They had all of these issues going on and they were trying to plug it. They didn't know how else to do it. So let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try that. Wow.
And then they would make another change and they would drop it into live production. It was just constant chaos. I believed the regulations were right. I supported them and I wanted to partner with the FDA. The owner of the company did not. He believed that the FDA and regulations were bad. He didn't want them anywhere near the business. And so that's where we were, this clash of the titans.
So you actually saw the potential that the FDA, the benefit that FDA would have on the industry, and he did not.
Correct. And in just a slight little thing, I had an ovarian cyst that had ruptured prior to that. And I was so weak because they would not give me a transfusion because my doctor was terrified to make me sick. And I didn't want to take my kids to the hospital, be afraid to have them have a transfusion that was a life-saving that they needed because we were afraid. And we just needed to make the software better.
Right.
And I spent 31 years trying to make that software better.
And I personally know somebody who did get sick because of transfusions at that time. So lifelong for her. And she's healthy, thankfully, but it was very, very scary stuff for her at the time. So
it was scary. We were reading, and again, I was with the blood center. So we were reading articles and they would make another announcement that we've got another, there was a set of triplets. Oh my gosh, that they were, little girls, triplet girls. And they transfused them thinking that they were going to be safer to transfuse them with one unit. Instead of 3, and they transfused him with the same unit that was positive, killed them all.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it was just heartbreaking. So I believed in the regulations. We were the first. Mary, I don't know the rest of her name. She had gone down and actually shut down the Red Cross in Portland. And then we were the next one that she came up, and the owner of the company was gone, and he was on vacation in Hawaii. And she knocked on the door. And I said, come on in. So he was gone. And once they were in, and I was pregnant with my 4th child at the time, and there was this almost game as to whether or not this inspection was going to get finished before this baby came.
Oh my God.
So you had a lot of challenges. It doesn't sound like necessarily the gentleman that you were working for at the time. You just disagreed on your approach on it. But did you experience any kind of pushback beyond what you've mentioned already because you were in a male-dominated world? And can you speak to that a little bit?
I think that, I was the only woman on the staff. So when I came there, again, I was the only woman and I originally started as just a contractor. So I did things with Alaska Airlines. I did things when they contracted me out on different jobs.
Gotcha.
My solution or my counter to that is I became the highest booked employee, period, that they had ever had. Because the guys would just sit back and say, oh, I don't want that job. I don't want that job. Well, I took them all. I wanted every ounce of experience that I could get. And I was out doing as many jobs as I could.
And where do you think that came from? Because it sounds like it's something like Jan said you were a born leader. But you had this drive, this kind of almost crazy drive, it sounds like, to tackle whatever you could.
Trying to feed my kids. By that point, I was a single mom with no child support. On my 30th birthday, I signed my divorce papers from my first marriage. Shortly thereafter, I was homeless with my 3 kids and no child support. And I was bankrupt, but I had a job.
So you empowered yourself to do as much as you could, to secure that job, learn as much as you could, so you could continue to feed your children, get a home, etc.
Yes.
Wow.
That's pretty powerful and very empowering.
It is definitely. So you talked about eventually buying that company. Can you talk a little bit about how you evaluated what made sense and how to go about doing that?
Well, again, I came from back to that family business. So my dad I was fifth generation, and my dad had always been a mentor in my life. And I wanted stock in this company. I had managed to get a very small portion of the company back to the FDA. That whole clash of what was happening with them, that resulted in the owner saying, one more word out of you. And I said, we have to do what they're telling us to do. And he said, I don't have to do anything. I own my own business. And I said, no, we need to do what they're telling us to do. The report that we got out of that inspection was mammoth. And he and I got into this argument in the hallway, and he said, one more word out of your mouth and you can pack your bags. And I went to my office and I was like, one, I only get one. What's it going to be? And I went in his office and I went, blah, 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 and I said, you're either selling me the company or I'm walking. And if I walk, most of the staff's going to go with me because they don't want to work for you. So that reached out to find my dad. And I said, you better get back home because I'm in the process of buying a company. And I don't have any money. I don't have anything. I mean, by this point, I was married at this point, and I had had my fourth child. Was starting to get my feet underneath me, but really didn't have anything. That was it. And my dad came back. He said, well, what makes you think that this is going to work? So we started pulling performance together. And when we started finally getting into the financial side, which I'd never really been in the financial side of the business, found out that the company was basically bankrupt. The owner was taking every drop of money he could out of it and was just running it into the ground. It was soon to be going down.
Which is why he probably didn't care about changing anything.
Right. He didn't see any future in it because he was in the here and now and just trying to take everything he could out of it. So he basically said, make me an offer. And so my dad and I sat down. Dad talked me through how to do a performance. Never done a performance in my life. We're going to go figure out what that means. This is before the internet. You didn't have ChatGPT to go help you. So we just started talking to everyone I could about it and looked at it and kept doing these performas. And my dad had so much clout with the bank. He took me down and he told the bank, he said, we're going to help her buy this company. And the bank says, well, it doesn't look really good on. And he goes, we're going to help her buy this company.
He believed in you. He truly believed in you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he could see what you had done and the things that you had conquered. And I think that also, we're different animals when we're kids and 18 and getting married than we are when we're 30. We're trying to feed 3, maybe 4 kids and a new family. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, so you bought the company and you got the company. How did you identify the things that you needed to delegate? Because you have these people that supported you in the company. You couldn't be Superwoman. I know we all try to be Superwomen, but you were a Superwoman, but you needed to give some of those jobs away. So how did you figure out what to do and where you needed to delegate work?
Well, that comes back to a funny story because on a regular basis, I was talking to my dad almost every day. So it was 14 days from the argument I had to 14 days that I owned the company.
Good for you.
And I bought it with a counter check because I said to my dad, I said, how exactly do we do this? And he goes, well, you got to write a check. And I said, I don't have a check. And he said to the bank, give her a counter check. And he said, well, what check number? They came back and said, what check number do you want this to say? I said, 1. So I bought the company with the counter check number 1. So it was, again, I'm an organized person. So I was into having meetings. I had 6 employees, so I think I was one of 6. And by the way, before I did this, I went to the clients that we had then, those ones that I could really trust and the close ones. And I said, guys, if I do this, are you guys staying with me? And they were like, absolutely. So I had their support for this shift. In fact, they were so frustrated with him. They were glad to get him out of the way, and they were glad that I was going to take over. And so we started to grow. First of all, we couldn't make the first payroll. So that got a little scary. But the clients started coming, and I wanted to grow, and I wanted leadership. And my dad, of course, I'm talking to Dad. By the way, I put my dad as the chairman of the board. So he became the chairman of the board. And I said, Dad, I need more people. Well, of course, I wanted to hire a mini me. I wanted another leader. And he said, is there anything you are doing that someone else could do? And I said, well, I don't know, Dad. And he goes, are you making copies? I go, well, of course I'm making copies. Are you doing this? He said, you have to look at everything on your plate as to what you can delegate off. And when you truly can't delegate anything more off to someone that's around you or someone below you, we'll start getting another person that's at your level. So he taught me about delegation.
That's really huge. And that's good for our listeners to hear, because we do try to do too much a lot of times. And a lot of times there's other people that can do that for us or should be doing that work.
I think when you're a type A plus, which we've talked about personality, which many of us are, I'm guilty of that for sure. It's very hard to give up control. You know that you can get stuff done in a very efficient manner very well. And so to give that away is sometimes harder than just doing it yourself. But it's an important lesson for our listeners really to learn, is that you do have to have that trust and that ability to delegate.
Well, and to realize that they may not do it exactly the way you did it, but it's still okay. It's still getting done. It doesn't have to be exactly the same.
Well, to that note, I became the queen of procedures, SOPs. People will laugh, but I even had a procedure on how to open the mail.
Okay, now that's a little extreme, Beth, I must admit, but
it is. But here's what happened. You know, the receptionist, we looked at every job and looked at how much exposure we had, how often it turned over, how often you did the job, was how much you actually needed the procedure, right? Because you were actually going to read it. And your receptionist is one of your highest turnover positions, because if they're good at their job, you usually move them into something else. And if they're bad in their job, they leave. And we had a new receptionist that was there. She got a letter from the FDA notifying us that they were coming in. It was our 6-day or our 3-day notice that they were coming in for inspection. And our QA, head of quality assurance, was gone on vacation. And she put the letter in the top of her in basket.
Oh, wow.
Yes. The FDA showed up and we had no preparation, because the letter was sitting in the in basket because the person opening the mail didn't know that anything with the FDA should not be put in an in basket.
Oh my gosh, I can only imagine. So I didn't work with the FDA, but I have been involved with the FAA when I worked in the aerospace industry. So I know how critical it is when they say they're coming in. There's usually a reason. And you need to be on your toes because you're going to be looking at everything.
And we had an semi-annual, I mean, there was multiple, and we could be inspected both by their biologics division and their device division as life went on. So I was believed in procedures. I have written thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of procedures because I believe that you should take the time to write it down so other people can read it. And that's what was happening. My office, I used to say, I'm going to have a number thing in my office. Take a number, because it was a zoo. And when I left in the morning, it was, I'll see you when I see you, because who knew when I was going to get home? And my desk time started when everyone left for the day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just not sustainable.
Right. You're right.
So I ended up with two things. I became a writer, and trust me, I am not a writer, and I would have loved ChatGPT back then. But I wrote procedures and I wrote user documentation. So when and see these spiral notebooks, every one of my employees was given a spiral notebook on day one. And when you come to my office, you bring your notebook. And when you ask a question, you're either asking me which SOP you don't understand or which user doc you don't understand. Because we're in the software world, there's two things. It's either how it's, and I believed in those documents. And when we had one that was wrong, we created a change control to fix it.
So Beth, I am also a procedure girl, so I understand. And even though I'm on the creative side, they don't necessarily go hand in hand. But I have taken the time as being somebody in a position of leadership where I've written stuff down because I train people in person, but then I would write it down and say, okay, if you have a question, go here first before you come back and see me. So I do really understand it. So what would you say is your biggest life lesson that you've learned about running a company?
I think probably delegation was probably one of the big ones right there. I don't think we could have ever grown. I had to give up. I guess I had to identify your weaknesses, hire them. And I was passionate about programming. I loved programming, but it wasn't sustainable for me as an owner of the company. I had to let that go. I had to let the programming side go, because you can't steer the ship if you are down in the engine room. You have to be up on top. And
that's a great analogy.
I love that.
That's
and
really
I can
great.
understand that.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Okay, this has been great. We're going to take a little break here and we'll come back and talk to you later.
Okay, thank you.
To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Empowered Life Lessons of Everyday Women. We would really appreciate if you could leave us a rating or a review. If you have any challenges or questions you are facing, we want to hear from you, as we value your input and suggestions. And if you have a compelling story or life lesson you would like to share, please connect with us at empoweredlifelessons@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, other social media platforms, or visit us at empoweredlifelessons.com. In our next episode, join us as we continue our conversation with Beth M. After retiring, listen to how Beth's desire to give back inspired her to establish a nonprofit, helping others together.